Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you all here in this last day of the conference. Yesterday, we mentioned that the literature production was a key aspect of the Sandinista popular rebellion because these effervescence of singers, writers, poets was part of a unique revolutionary image. The Sandinista revolution offered the hope of a new socialist model, something that maybe in English they would have called socialism with a human face. And this had an important impact in the international stage because for the public opinion in Europe, Latin America, the US, the work of different people, Yoconda Belli, Ernesto Cardenal, Claribel Alegría, was part of that sympathy and that emotion that the Sandinista revolution generated in the world. But even within Nicaragua, it was through this culture of literary production that the feelings in Nicaragua were transformed. That idea that society could be transformed from one day to the next. And for the generation that did not live Somoza's dictatorship or the civil war, the writings is even more real than the history to understand what happened in Nicaragua. The story, the center fielder from Sergio Ramirez, provides a more tangible version of how they were repressed under Somoza's dictatorship and why a generation felt the need to rise up against a dictatorship. Or, for example, the novel Vuelo de Cuervo from Erwin Danton Nevara. It gives a sensation of how the utopic dream of the Sandinista revolution got corrupted. And it's just a small part of the great literary works generated by the Sandinista revolution. So it's a pleasure to introduce Eric Blandon Guevara, who is a literature professor in the University of Missouri Columbia, and he has a doctorate in Latin American culture and Latin American culture studies from Pittsburgh University and a master's degree in creative writing from the University of Texas at El Paso. He's a he writes stories and essays and poetry. During his youth, uh, he worked in different cultural institutions of the revolutionary government, and he was part of a youth university group. And he has written many groups of poetry, and in fiction, he has published a short story collection, Misterios Gozosos, and novel Vuelo de Cuervos, which was republished in 2017 by Alfaguara in Mexico. And he can tell us the other works he's published. There are too many to name right now. And we also have Sergio Ramirez Mercado. You know what his role was in the vice presidency of the Republic and then the foundation of the Sandinista Renovation Movement, but we haven't spoken about his great uh, literary trajectory. In 2011, he received the José Donoso Prize in Chile. In 2014, the Carlos Fuentes Prize in Mexico. And in 2017, he won the Miguel de Cervantes Prize in Spain. And he dedicated it to the new democratic fight in Nicaragua. So please, let's welcome them. And what we are going to do is to have a conversation. But first off, I want to invite Eric to tell us what his experience was as an artist and as someone who participated in the revolution, and then Sergio, what was the contradiction or the link between the cultural and artwork and the political pride. Good morning. I want to thank uh, you first off for inviting me and being here with you. I would divide uh, the our production surrounding the revolution in three parts. The first part was the revolutionary fight against the dictatorship of Somoza that had this mobilization of the students in Nicaragua. Typically, the military narrative of the revolution has been imposed over the story, for example, of mass student movements and their parents. Because with each student, their parents were involved, their neighbors were involved. For example, in Nicaragua, the first great liberation of political prisoners was not by storming a house or the palace, the government palace. It was through the movement, the church movement, as we call it, in 1970, 1971, where a great amount of students participated from high schools and universities, and where many of us here met each other, and then we joined the college student movement. So, in my experience, what we did was, besides going to the streets, calling the people to rebellion, asking them to fight for political prisoners, among them Daniel Ortega, and in churches, where we used to go to read poetry and give or take this movement to the masses. So one aspect of it is the revolutionary poetry, but then once in power, we we became bureaucrats, and this process of becoming bureaucrats, those of us who had the literary vocation and those of us who thought that our lives would go around literature, we dedicated to a lot of different things and not writing. And this created very serious internal conflicts and uh, difficult situations because, on one side, being a writer or an intellectual was not well regarded by those in power. And those of us who confronted the power due to literature were the writers. They asked us to participate in the party, to participate in the military, to be on the streets, to stay at the front of institutions, and we were criticized publicly because we weren't doing anything, or because we thought that we were the best thing ever. And it was terrible because there was a writer that was the director of the children's hospital. There was another writer who was the director of immigration, and then the media division of the ministry. We had Joconda Belli and me, who were in the party structures working in the propaganda of the FSLN, and it was very difficult. And on the other hand, from the top, they promoted what was wrongly called the testimonial literature, that stopped having that sense of urgency that testimonies should have by recounting the story from the top according to the personal stories of those who had participated in the guerrillas. So, what they asked of us was to write testimonial literature. And if it wasn't testimonial in nature, it wasn't considered literature. So, I'm just talking about my experience and the experience of many of my colleagues. At the time, that was when we lost. The electoral defeat made us wake up. Yesterday, Carlos Fernando was talking about how they woke up when they were defeated. And before we had a slogan that said, "We won, we're free, we will never be slaves again." And after 1990, we started to say, "We lost, we're free, we'll never be slaves again." And I I noticed that I was going into a rebellious process against myself and what I had been. And in that sense, I noticed that I was tired and I needed to break off with the violence in my past because I understood that violence had led me to be a bureaucrat and party worker and the calcification of my ideology. So the only way I could recover what we had lived through, because I thought it was very important, just like Marcel Proust thinks, you cannot lose the beauty of youth before the sea. We had a great military experience that couldn't be lost. And going back to what was said yesterday about the conflict with the Caribbean people that I had to live through personally, the transfer of the communities of Rio Coco to the interior, to Tapapri, I remember that for us, those who participated in that process, we noticed that that wasn't the revolution that we had fought for and dreamed of. Because I felt, alongside another group, there were writers, there were poets in that group. I remember Michel Nally, Gloria Gawardi, myself, and another another professionals. We were all young, from the 60s and 70s that had fought for an ideal. When we noticed that we were there and that the mosquitoes saw us as awful human beings, and we had gone there with this hope of being uh, their helpers and taking these backwards people to the modern times, I noticed that we were the ones that were backwards, and we didn't know what was going on. We were ignorant to what was going on, and there was a series of contradictions and internal conflicts that we couldn't break with our past because it was a betrayal of what we were doing. We were very committed to what we were doing, but there was an instance that was awful and it was something unexpected, but a great metaphor of the situation. It was when we were going to move the towns that came into the Riviera to the interior. You had to cross a huge river called the Huaspuk River, and they were waiting for us to organize the transfer. Army troops that had been there from the day before were waiting for us, and they were dying of hunger because we took a long time to get there. And when we got there, we found a great rebellion of the Mesquita women that had arrived, that were running around the river, shouting and raising their hands, saying, "Alui, Alui, Alui." And what happened? The Mesquitas are crying. And it was because the soldiers wanted to eat and they didn't have anything to give them, but there were coconuts. And the boss uh, told them to grab the coconuts, and there were three soldiers that could go up the palm tree and cut the coconuts. And the boss said to cut down the whole tree, not to climb it and take the coconuts. And for the Mesquita women, that was like the Notre Dame Cathedral fire in Paris. They were enraged, and we protested and said, "What happened? Why did you do this? This is too violent." And the colleagues that protested, that were women, were imprisoned by our colleagues, and they were sanctioned for 5 days. And we were in a situation that we couldn't believe, but the military reasoning imposed itself over human reasoning. So we went back, we did what we needed to do. I knew that there was something strange and we hadn't done the right thing, but we stayed within the revolution. We were never going to leave. I never thought of leaving the revolutionary movement and renouncing the Sandinista front. I never thought about it, but the election defeat made me reflect on things, and when I came to study creative writing to El Paso with a grant, I noticed that I wanted to write a novel about something, and the image that I had in my mind was a cadaver that I saw in Guatemala. It was a body of a very rich man in the city of Matagalpa that couldn't be buried, and he spent a week, 2 weeks there, and the family had to take him out of the backyard of their homes, and they had to put him there in front of the Episcopal Church. And on July 20 in Matagalpa, there were a lot of people, and I thought I need to tell this story because I imagine crows, but we were the crows. How am I going to tell a story that everyone knows if what I should talk about is how we ourselves were crows on our own people?
Eh, voy a
Thank you very much. I think I would like to talk about this from a different perspective. If the revolution had a culture, figures, all of these key figures, I think, were Ernesto Cardenal, but they weren't ones that were created in the revolutionary movement or, you know, to become famous because of the revolution. They just accompanied the revolution because of their prestige. I would say that Ernesto Cardenal put words to the revolution, and the other figure put the music to the revolution. Both were well known internationally, and because of that fame, they really put a name to the revolution. Mejia, I think, had a future in Spain as a musician. He he had a song that he made specifically about the Nicaraguan Revolution, and that was heard all over the radio in Latin America and in Spain. And he had very profitable contracts. He had composed a song as well that won an international contest that existed at the time in Latin America. I think it was called Otis. And I wanted to talk about this because there's always that ethical portion of it that was always in the midst of all of this. When we had the soccer, the World Cup, They paid him thousands of dollars to use that song as the World Cup song, as the theme song. And he said, no, absolutely not. He did not want to sign this contract. His agent, his literary agent or musical agent did not understand why Carlos was doing this because they were offering him a ton of money. But he said, well, because before we have this military dictatorship and also because he's not going to reduce this song to becoming a brand, a commercial brand. So Carlos abandoned everything, his future as a musician, of having this international fame, and he instead gave music to the revolution. He did end up writing a series of songs that explained how to arm and disarm all of the weapons, which I thought was incredible, because to explain in a song how to arm and disarm a weapon, I think is just incredible, So Carlos Mejia, the musician, and Ernesto Cardenal on the other hand. Ernesto, I think, is 94 years old now, and we are used to this figure, Ernesto Cardenal, in Nicaragua, but I think he's one of the most important literary figures in the world. When you compare him to other literary figures. In 1960s, the late 1960s, early 1970s, the Psalms were published in Germany, and that was by Ernesto Cardenal. And this book was published in other European countries, and it became a very important book for European youth. And his fame started to grow because of these Psalms and other books that started to be translated at the time. So I think the doors to international solidarity opened magically because of Ernesto Cardenal. It was a pleasure for me to be able to accompany him on some of the tours. And nobody would say no to him. I remember once in Switzerland, we were at a meeting, and they had told Ernesto that there were two offices in the same building. In one, it is, humanitarian, and the other one was for arms. And he kind of mixed up the two. And there was an elderly woman, and Ernesto started to say that he was there, that he was asking for money for camps, for food. I mean, everything was going to be for the military fight, right? And he told the woman all of this story, and the lady said, no, we only give money for weapons. We don't give money for humanitarian aid. And so Ernesto started to say, well, okay, yes, well, that too, That too, of course. We do the same thing. We, receive money for the fight. And then he started to kind of change his story in front of the old lady. But the revolution triumphed. And Ernesto Cardenal, I think, given the logic that existed at the time, my colleague here was listing and talking about the other writers that were involved in this process. But Ernesto Cardenal was named the Minister of Culture. I mean, nobody else could do it. Everybody was in agreement that it had to be him. So he was a very disciplined man, and therefore he accepted the position of Minister of Culture. And he installed his office in the house where Somoza had lived with Doña Hope de Somoza before um, getting together with his lover and constructing the other house in La Curva. And so that house was so big that I think Ernesto's office pretty much fit in the bathroom. I remember there was a huge bathroom. Maybe it was in the bedroom, but I do remember an enormous bathroom. So his office was in one of those rooms. And his writings were completely improvisational. Nobody knew at the time what a ministry of culture was. That was something very new in Nicaragua. But the minister of culture was kind of a cultural access. But he also had to create different institutions, cultural institutions that nobody even knew could have existed. So, for example, he established a film institution. So we started to show films and movies. In Nicaragua, they co-produced different films in order to show internationally. He also established an institution to make music records, and a separate cultural entity which didn't really depend on the Ministry of Culture, was autonomous. And he also had an editorial house, a publishing house that was under the Ministry of Culture, and that was more involved in the publication of political documents, although every now and then a novel would be published. And also another publishing house that I think during its existence published 200 books and maybe about 800,000 essays. And that was something that had never before been seen in Nicaragua. I think now, before that, writers had to pretty much self-publish. And so we saw that there were all of these launches, there were classical publications, foreign publications, and Nicaraguan publications without any kind of discrimination based on ideology. They never said that they were not going to publish somebody because they had a different ideology or an idea that didn't go along with the revolution. So writers were in the most surprising areas. For example, Fernando Silva was the director of the Children's Hospital because he was a pediatrician. But I remember Chichi Fernandez, the poet, was the secretary of the penitentiary system. I mean, that's the strangest thing I've ever heard. I mean, and especially Chichi. I mean, to think that a poet has all of the prisoners of the country under his custody, that just is contradictory. There was also a director of immigration, a woman who was also a writer, a poet. So it was the idea that poets can pretty much do anything. And so Ernesto Mejia Sanchez was the first ambassador of the revolution to Spain. There was a painter who was the ambassador at UNESCO, and I think to Brazil as well. And I think it's because there were so few writers who were not on the side of the revolution, or artists that were not on the side of the revolution. And they also created an industry of art posters that the History Institute did. So you can really see the history of the revolution through these posters. They were used for campaigns of all kinds, not only for the anniversaries of the revolution, but also for the literary campaigns. And there was just lots of graphic art that was done for these revolutionary posters. Now, despite all of the contradictions that Eric has mentioned, and that writers are sometimes not trusted because sometimes they don't produce work. I think in the revolution, we never saw this Sandinista realism. We never made a manual of how to write or how to paint or how to write music. There was a cultural trend, obviously, and we knew that the point of the cultural institute or the cultural ministry was so that we can have all of these paintings and writings and poems about the revolution. But obviously, poetry wasn't going to always be talking about the revolution. And in 1995, when the Constitution was approved, or I'm sorry, well, 1995 is a key year for me, but no, the Constitution was passed in 1987. And in that Constitution, there's an article that I don't think exists in any other Constitution in the world. And it says that the artistic creation is free and is not subject to any regulation. And so I think that it's almost like getting healed in the health sector. For example, we were trying to ensure that no one in the future would say that artistic production needed to be in line with the revolution or anything like that. And so, I think that it was established as a constitutional principle, this artistic freedom. In the revolution, they said poets, writers were always very important. But when Armand Rusti, the German, came to Nicaragua, he said that it seemed like everyone in Nicaragua was a poet. And so I would like to ask you, why is it that some revolutionary figures like Tomás Borges, Daniel Ortega, felt the need to publish poems? I think that's actually a very unique aspect of the revolution. Well, I think it's everyone's responsibility, isn't it? You have to value yourself as a writer. And I also think that that comes from a very old tradition that doesn't have to do with the revolution. I mean, everyone in Nicaragua, I think, considers themselves a poet. The university where I studied, everybody would say, "Hello, poet." Even if you weren't a poet, that was what you would say when you would say hello to somebody. It didn't matter if you were talking to the gardeners or to the other students, the professors, you would say, "Hello, poet." And then later on, when we had the political party, the PAN, they would say, "Oh, illustrative panista." So it was a more modern version of it. Also, I didn't think that I was a poet, but I knew that I was a novelist. And that was a different case. It was something to be studied. For example, I had to edit the book La Pacienta Impaciencia, and he was convinced that this was a novel. And I kept saying, Commander, this isn't a novel. It isn't testimony. It's just a collection of writings. And he says, no, it's superior to 100 Years of Solitude. So, in your opinion, the Sandinista revolution was important for Maria Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes. Why was it so important for them? Well, I think that this is a much deeper history, but I think when we saw the Sandinista revolution, we see this case of Padilla in 1996. And it was a cultural support that they were giving unanimously to the revolution. So Carlos Fuentes wrote his most important novel in Cuba, La Muerte de Artemio Cruz. The Death of Artemio Cruz was the book that he wrote in Cuba. One of the most important writers of Latin America at the time was asking someone how he should invest the money of a prize that he won for the writer. And he recommended that he give it to Che Guevara, who was about to go to Bolivia. And so obviously Vargas Llosa did not accept that recommendation. But, I just want to say with this that writers and cultural structures of the Cuban Revolution, I think, were linked. It affected all of the most important Latin American artists and writers. And then in 1967, we see the Padilla case, and a lot of writers said, well, I'm going to stop here. They signed a document. We saw the oppression of homosexuals as well, which affected a lot of the writers. They put homosexual people in concentration camps. And so they were able to relate to the Cuban Revolution in some way, like Carlos Fuentes. And then you saw that the Nicaraguan Revolution was a different type of stressor. It was not aligned. It was following a totalitarian model. In Cuba, we saw this Sol party, this communist party. And so there was this attractive lure that led to Garcia Marquez participating as a conspirator with the Sandinista movement, trying to get political and economic support for the revolution. So it was a completely different scenario. So I would say, who didn't come to Nicaragua? Out of all of the famous writers, Salman Rushdie, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who didn't go to Nicaragua to, add to the revolution in some way. Julie Christie, Susan Rezando, Montegras. I mean, I can tell you about 5 or 6 Nobel Prize winners that were in Nicaragua at the time. So I think that was something that was always maintained. Well, but I think that we could not really conclude this panel without talking about the contradictions that we saw in the cultural sector that were very serious and that distracted the attention of the President of the Republic, because he was involved in this union battle between the writers and the leaders of the union, which since then, I think in 1984, us writers, we told the Sandinista Front that this woman was somebody who was disqualifying, conflicting, that just kind of instigated this war between everyone. But the president obviously is going to listen to the person with which they're sleeping, and we couldn't even sleep. So I think there was a huge problem, a huge conflict that you cannot ignore. Because the revolution, yes, it is true that it had a series of cultural, artistic initiatives, and a new industry was created, the film industry, graphic arts, like in those propaganda posters, but there were a lot of conflicts that were quite serious and violent, and that in some way I think were pointing out the fact that this woman wanted to control and wanted to have power over it. She disqualified and discredited all of the writers, including Carlos Mejía Godoya, Carlos Menal, and to pit us against the National Directorate. I remember there was a meeting where there was this conflict. I think the problem was that she could not treat writers like she mistreated other artists, because writers thought that we had a background already in the revolution and we felt that we had already won a seat at the table. On the contrary, other artists didn't feel this, so they had to kind of subject themselves to that mistreatment. And there was a meeting that was horrible, and Sergio was there as well, with Daniel Ortega, Borges, where Daniel Ortega made fun of Ernesto Cardenal, telling him that artists have laughed at the Sandinista movement with his Solentinami project. And he said, but you forget that if it hadn't been because of that craziness by Ernesto Cardenal, the revolution would not be globalized. Ernesto was the one that globalized the Sandinista revolution. So there was this whole effort to undermine the project from within. And so we saw this, that the central objective was the National Directorate. She wanted to destroy the National Directorate, and I can see now that she succeeded. She reduced it to just being her and him. Slowly she did this. And so when we talk about this Sandinista front crisis and the abandonment of these historic paintings, I think it was because of this undermining power that was being constructed slowly. So I go back to that topic of why is it that in my novel I tried to make the characters and power as if it were a carnival. Because I think it is absurd that when you look at the history of the revolution, there was a separation between the revolutionary people and the other people. And that there were people that were just dancing to a tune that was old. Nobody was dancing to that anymore. But we need to talk about this. We need to say this, because if we only talk about all of the nice things of the revolution and everything that was pretty about the revolution, there's going to be a lot of problems. So in comparison to the Cuban Revolution, I think the good thing is that we could talk and we could have a union. So it's, they didn't tell us what we had to write about. and we didn't lose that critical spirit, that internal critical spirit. You know, what I'm saying now, you can find it in some article in La Prensa. I was part of a group of people that signed a document that was alerting the Sandinista Front and the President of the Republic about Miss Rosario and the bad things that she did. And so in the headline, you see all of the names of the people that signed that document. So there are so many things that have led us to our current situation. And I don't know if it was that we did not prevent it or because we ignored it, we just pretended that it didn't exist. Well, I think Ernesto Cardenal was the cultural figure, and we have to ask ourselves why. And it was because this woman wanted cultural power for herself. And so if you think about it, somebody who wants all power, then they don't want culture, because I think culture is marginal in Nicaragua. You know, I think that the cultural ministry nearly doesn't even get listed among the ministries of Nicaragua. And it only has a $2 billion budget. So that's not nearly enough for all of the libraries and all of the events. And that was back in 2006. And so she basically eliminated culture completely. So I think she separated Ernesto Cardenal so that she can somehow take over and become, you know, the person with all of the cultural power. You know, it's almost like she wanted to be named in books and things, you know. I mean, I don't know exactly what was going on. But this fight with Ernesto Cardenal, and she ended up destroying the cultural ministry because cultural ministry had to be closed. And then all of those funds went over to the union, which was also quite absurd. But that was her goal, is to destroy the cultural ministry. I think in the National Directorate, she had very little sympathy for the cultural ministry. There was also a contradiction in the literary sector that went beyond the revolutionary movement. There was Antonio Cuadra, and he was one of the most recognized literary figures besides Ernesto Cardenal. But I think the sectoral error was made against this man, Paul Antonio Cuadra. I remember when Ernesto Darío was given the order. There were so many, you know, literary figures there: Ernesto Morales, Sánchez, Cardenal, Carlos Martínez Riva, José Coronel Ortecho, Alberto Torres, and they completely excluded Paul Antonio Cuadra from the list. And I think that this contributed to the fact that Paul Antonio was not looked at a great literary figure because he didn't receive this recognition from the government. I mean, I thought that this was absurd. This was a distinction. This was an award. You know, I think that you have to recognize that that his work is still incredible, even if he hadn't gotten the prize or the recognition It's not the recognition or the prize that makes the literary work, but rather the author. Well, there was also lots of political fight in the country. He represented the press. So I think that to recognize Paulo Antonio Cuadra was also to recognize the press. And the press was completely on the other side. So nobody in the Sandinismo movement would have recognized him because he also represented the press.
80.
It was in 1980. The medal? It was early. Well, I don't know, but it seems to me that it was a discriminatory act. He had already had a fight against the revolution because in the beginning he was there. In the first few months, I remember there's an emblematic picture in the Ministry of Culture of Ernesto, Paulo Antonio, Coronel, etc. But he left little by little, and I was lucky to be his friend always. And I remember he once told me, the day I accept a prize or an award, I commit to them, because if you owe something to power, they're going to have to bow to them because you're in their debt. And I remember that when Salinas arrived, you remember when I told you that you shouldn't receive any awards because then you're sort of in their debt. He didn't want anything to do with the revolution. It was obvious that he had an ethical attitude with regards to power, and he was loyal to that idea. The state played a positive role in fostering culture, and what happened after 1990, after the 1990 elections. What was the state's role in terms of culture? The Culture Institute, if the revolution had uh, removed the ministry aspect of it, it had become the Cultural Institute, and when the administration changed, it lost its official uh, aspect, and Doña Gladys Espinosa de Ramirez was named the culture director. She was a theater actress, and it plays a role. It didn't have this relevance it had in the years of the revolution, but it still was a ministry that received support from the government because the economic crisis was going on too. So, well, but the state's role as a rector wasn't something that I would like to be repeated. It's true that they weren't just facilitators. They could become a competitor of artists. In the case of Tomás Borges, that I'm always going to mention, because he uh, was in the middle of everything, and he didn't have anything to do with culture, because it was either Sergio or Ernesto Cardenal, but he was around and people had to see what to do, because the commander is here, he wants us to sing this song, to paint this here, or to place him there, and those were things that leading attitude, can we say that leading attitude by the state could be limiting, because they impose things from the top down. I don't want to exclude myself because I'm one of those who was the part of the transmission belt. And I said, we have to do this because the commander says we have to. And at the end of the day, you notice that it uh, stopped many creative initiatives. And another negative thing that I see in the actions, they promoted a kind of culture dangerously, and they generalized that some anthropologists have said that the labor of the Ministry of Culture was extending the San Lucas workshop project of the 40s of the vanguardista movement, and they imposed this national folklore, even though they promoted the artistic and musical activities of the Caribbean coast. For example, Fernando Cardenal remembers how when he was finishing the literacy crusades in the whole country, he looked to dance the Masaya dance, and it was imposed as a national dance, even in the north, and it had nothing to do with us. I'm from the north, and we didn't even have marimba there. We had to use a disc and make noise so that they could dance the Masaya dance. And those kinds of things were generalized. So this is national folklore. I defer to what Eric is saying. I think one of the most important things that the Ministry of Culture did was to give back the country that sense of the autochthonous culture, valuing popular culture, because the Somocismo had buried that entirely, and they rescued the different crafts in each region. For example, the Jinotega craft that was forgotten, and through the Ministry of Culture, uh, they stimulated craftsmen that work with ceramics to do so again. In Matagalpa, they work with different threads, and they produce the cotton thread again. They rescued the art of the embroidered jicaras. So they gave value again to art and crafts in the country. The food, when the embargo from the U.S. came, wheat, they did a corn fair, and they revalued the gastronomy of Nicaragua that was based on corn. So I think that there was a multiple rescue of culture, and I'm not so sure. And this is just a comment, I don't have any evidence. I'm not so sure if the extension of marimba and the Masaya folkloric dances in the whole country was the product of a policy of the Ministry of Culture, or it came from before. It came from before that, right? So it's a project that I'm telling you about that the vanguardistas had in San Lucas. Yes, because in Bluefield you had the San Jerónimo procession from before. It's a Masaya tradition, but it became a Bluefield tradition. That procession of San Jerónimo. So that is not a work of the revolution. It's due to the massive migrations of the mestizo people to the Caribbean that have made the autochthonous people the minority, because demographically the population of the Caribbean coast, especially in the south, is more mestizo than before. So the Creoles and the Sumo are a minority because there was a mestizo invasion due to agriculture and cattle ranges and the colonos, the terrible history of the colonos. But there's been a uh, mes- mestization of the coast. Yes, but all of that has its origin in the cultural project that the group of the San Lucas Workshop imagined in the 40s. And it reached its maximum expression with Arnoldo Alemán when he substituted Sandino for the Huehuense. And it's something that we haven't spoken about, and we should talk about it. It was the substitution of the hero for the satrapa Pícaro, and in Nicaragua they thought that the Huehuense was a hero, and he wasn't. And where does all of this come from? It comes from the origins in 1940, and when this man got to power, he substituted the Sandino hero for the carterista because he promoted the pickpocket as a symbol of the national identity. And a lot of people say, "Oh, the Wawense came out of me." They still say the Wawense comes out of Nicaraguans in the elections, and it's a cultural invention that is repeated and has been built. In one of my books, a study that I did that was uh, that showed the symptoms in the government of Alemán, the Pícaro would replace would have that heroic role. The Pícaro went into power. We wanted to uh, get some questions in, but lastly, a question about the importance of culture in the current political junction. Maybe Eric can say something more about it, but I would like to say that many times it is expected that a historic period, it is expected of a historic period to produce literature. Uh, the literature that was written in the revolution, it wasn't a product of the revolution. These were already made writers. And the question would be, where is the revolution's literature? The literature that tells what happened in the revolution. The literature doesn't tell the story of historical events. It's based on historical events to talk about human life. And I would say that that literature will need to be written just as this other part of the history of Nicaragua is written by the grandchildren of the revolution. This literature will be written. Literature is always about the past. The present is encompassed by reports and journalistic reports. The literature is always about the past. It tells the tales of the past, and generally it takes a long time, decades. So that the first great novel of the Napoleonic invasion to Russia in 1911 came about, uh, decades went by before Tolstoy wrote War and Peace. So it took a while to arrive. And the barricades in Paris and the fall of the fall of Luis Felipe and the installment of Napoleon. It's in the Elemental Education of Flaubert, and 30 years went by. So when this literature that tells the story of the revolution is going to be by people who were not witnesses to those, uh, to what happened, it's what their parents or grandparents lived through. And as it's starting to happen, there's going to be a critical perspective of looking at this not from the political commitment. It's difficult when you are partisan to an idea, an ideology, or a political system. You do propaganda. You don't have a critical work of literature. So if it's not done uh, in a critical way to deal with past uh, history, it's not going to have a lot of weight. But I think that that's the literature that is starting to form, that can tell the stories uh, without any partisanship. I think that there's a great example of the Russian Revolution in the Soviet Union, and what Sergio says. The great novel of the revolution, of the Soviet Revolution, wasn't written from the power. It's Dr. Zhivago, Boris Pasternak, or Margarita Bulgakov, when they distance themselves from the history of violence, and with great fatigue they see how there's a dissolution of individuals within this mass of people. And with the character of Lara, he tries to talk about the subjectivity, the romantic uh, of people that see the world passing by them. And there was never a novel uh, written by people that were in power. Well, Shovemov, but you can compare it. But what uh, catches my attention is that with this technology, we're seeing a cultural and artistic production every day. The memes, these types of uh, forms of narration that social networks are producing are other ways to recount history. They're different from the ones that came before them, and I think that they are uh, very important. But I think that we need to differentiate them from the daily chronicles or news. But being away from this is important for there to be works of art, because being critical and the aesthetics cannot be separated. So now let's have a series of questions. We have Donald, Cristiana, and Luis. Here in my hands I have an interview that I did to Paulo Antonio Cuadra in 1989. I'm going to read some lines of it. I started to break off from Sandinistas due to a discussion that I had with Bayardo Arce, who said that the revolution was a fountain of rights. And I said that to be a fountain of rights, it had to respect rights. And then there was a fight between the Sandinistas and the Mosquitos. I wanted to save the revolution at that time, and I proposed that we did a symposium with the press, with representatives from the parties in power at the time, the Mosquitos and the Sandinista commanders. They all accepted, and the commanders accused the Mosquitos of being separatists and agents of imperialism. So I responded to one of the little commanders, I think his name was Campbell, that the Mosquitos were uh, fighting for what they had achieved in the agreement of reincorporation of the Mosquitia. It was something that Nicaragua owed to them. It wasn't, uh, they weren't able to get that from the government. And what they asked was to respect them when the Sandinistas named the authorities in their communities. And they uh, chastised them. And they immediately communicated with General Humberto Ortega, who responded, "These Negroes, what they like is to be treated with sticks and lead. And as everyone knows, they hit them with sticks and shot at them with lead, and they had the first massacre at a Mezquito church. And just to clear up how that breaking off of Paulo Antonio with the revolution happened. Yes, my question is for Sergio. Are we going to have to wait for decades to read the novel of Daniel's period and the Rosario that started being the past in April 2018? And if you were cooking it, what would be the title? To write that novel, I have to go into exile. We can fix that. It's tempting, yeah. In that time, especially in Nicaragua, written literature was the art of the art of the art by excellence and the medium of communication. But now there's new languages like audiovisual languages. So how is this going to affect or won't affect, and how is this going to enrich the narrative, the fiction about the revolutionary period? Well, can I answer? Yeah. To answer Cristiana's question, I think that the couple, the Ormo couple, as people say in Nicaragua, is really tempting for a novelist. I think that the literary models are prefixed. There's an order. A novelist just has to empty what he wants to say into the novel, but I think that this couple fits perfectly in the model of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. It's the perfect model to tell this story. It's not just a tragedy. This could be a tragedy and a comedy, but it's one of the tempting topics for any writer. And the languages, you are a specialist on that, Eric. I don't have that title, but what I think is that they are being incorporated. For example, with cinema and the videos we're seeing, they have phones have a protagonist role. They're almost characters because through the cell phone they shared everything that was happening in the Camino de Oriente, so it became an essential character to represent the new youth movement. What? I want to tell you something. There's some movie that hasn't come out yet that is called Las Cabezas de la Hidra, or The Hydra's Heads, where the character of Lady Macbeth, exactly Rosario Murillo, everything is built based on phones. The phones carry the plot, and this movie is about to come out. But I think that they novels won't be able to be buried, but we have these other languages coming into the picture, and in cinema, the author that made that movie lives in Nicaragua, but he cannot put the movie out. He never mentions Lady Macbeth, but he mentions the name of her husband with the famous San Rafael del Norte's fresco of the devil. So anyone will be able to read the subtext. It's called the Hydra's Head. So I am under the impression I don't live in Nicaragua. We have time for one more round of questions. My name is David Goulet from the Hermanamiento Newton in San Juan del Sur, and I've been following Nicaraguan culture for 35 years. And this year, it seems that every week in San Juan del Sur there's bread and circus demonstrations that we're all happy, nothing happened, to erase April of last year. But I had a problem in my Facebook page in English. I had the opinion of maybe Loen Rio is not the best poet in Nicaragua's history. Sometimes he's a little boring. And the political secretary of the Orteguista Front attacked me on Facebook publicly, saying that God was guilty of uh, creating Nicaragua, and why a gringo like me was questioning Rubén Darío. The students in Nicaraguan schools memorize Hora Cero by Ernesto. They memorize the princesa está triste. If I listen to that again, I'll kill myself. The students dressed with the clothes, and it's amazing. It's like cultural paralysis, I think. And it's a mirror of the political paralysis. It's really sad. In the 80s, I had the opportunity, the great privilege, of introducing the peasant poetry of Sonetename to English readers. And it was a magazine of the New York Times. And that poetry of the humble people of Nicaragua, people were happy to read about it. And there's been a fall of cultural values in Nicaragua since then, and it hurts a lot, including Juan Antonio Cuadra. Do the students know about Pablo Antonio Cuadra's poetry or Ernesto's poetry? I don't know. That's just my personal testimony, but I think that there's this it's calcification in Nicaragua. First Marjorie and then Douglas.
As journalists, we often find ourselves saying, you can't make this stuff up. Constantly, we're confronted that. And I'm wondering, when you're confronted with a character like Rosario, and she is in a journalist world kind of a fictional character. I mean, she creates these fake trees, and people call her either the witch, or I guess some supporters think of her as a savior, and the way she speaks and the way she acts in this figure. How, as writers, how do you fictionalize a character like that?
Good question.
Thank you very much. More so than literature, you're talking about culture. And I think that there's been a sort of cultural, ideological, and symbolic promiscuity, uh, including the delegates of the Sandinista Revolution. And to talk about that, I'm going to tell you about two things that happened during the civil insurrection, and on one of them I told Dr. Sergio Ramirez that was symbolic in the UNAM. Uh, three young guys that were tattooed and were burning a flag of the Sandinista front while someone played Nicaragua Nicaragüista on the violin next to them. And they said, "Death to the Sandinista front." And when you look at the picture, anyone from the outside could say, they're Sandinistas before burning the flag. And they were Sandinistas before April 18 in favor of Daniel Ortega. And the second thing I want to talk about is that they invited us to the corporation, and the young people never listened to the corporation. It was always seen as a conservative radio station. But that day, El Pueblo Unido was being played, and we felt bad about going in there. And they said, "You're gonna be a reactionary. You're gonna go to the corporación now." So it's been very difficult in this crisis it's been very difficult to be coherent in this crisis, but I think that the youth has deconstructed all of the symbols, and they gather symbols from different places. And what could we say are the cultural paradigms in Nicaragua? Mapache Malvado, Polar Mandávico, that make memes and videos, and they're creating a new way of political critique and retelling things. And it's a paradox because sometimes they talk about a generational crisis before and after April 2018, but that is within the young generation, because those who were the influent young people, they're not the reference anymore. The new ones came out of nowhere. So what reflection do you have of that cultural promiscuity and the deconstruction of the symbols? In Economo, they painted Sandino in white and blue or red and black. And what do you think about that?
Como rebelión.
Well, I think we have to look at it as a rebellion and not revolution, so that the rebellious person and the rebellion is in constant creation, taking into account the coherences of the moment and alerting itself and alerting about the danger of achieving power, which is what revolutions do. You know, it's said that revolution looks for power, and at that moment stops being a revolution when it is already institutionalized, when others now see it as, you know, what's called the manada, or the herd, as De Luz would call it, where now they have power and they have their own army, and the revolution is now the power, the government, the state. But rebellion means that it is constantly evolving. So I feel like that freshness that we see today represents that absence of a project or a program that our revolution had. Mentally, we already have all of these contradictions with regard to the idea of what we were going to do and what we wanted to do. And I think that this is something that you cannot do while you're being rebellious. In order to be a revolutionary, you have to give up your rebelliousness, and you have to then subject yourself to a program and lose that freedom. I think that is the difference. Well, I would like to comment on the example of Rubén Darío. He is not at fault for his own instrumentalization, but this isn't something new. Rubén Darío was always taken as an official figure the Somoza regime took him as an official figure, and all of this culture that Nicaragua was representing, you know, and represents every time it's the anniversary of the birth date of Ruben Darío, and where, you know, there's like a parade where a woman walks in the parade with a crown and everything. And so I think that this is what we see when we celebrate Ruben Darío, and we see that his work is taught at schools, but they are teaching the common Ruben Darío what it sounds best. But this doesn't diminish his literary work. You know, the most transcendental works that I think that we have in Spanish. I think that Ruben Darío is used as a symbol of exclusion of the rest. It is taught at schools so that you don't have to teach about the writers that, you know, maybe were against the Somoza regime. To use Ruben Darío, you're using him as a factor of exclusion for the remaining authors. He's dead, he can't harm anybody, and so he doesn't represent any risk. So you see him in the educational system of the country, and I think that all of the other writers have pretty much disappeared from official programs. Well, I think that that's... Yes, I just wanted to reiterate that, yes, authors have disappeared. So, yes, thank you very much for the talk.